Hello there, everyone. So, right off the bat, I apologize in advance if you hear like a slight humming sound in the background for the next couple of videos, because I have a fan on and it's midsummer, I live in the middle of a desert, I'm not gonna be turning it off. Anyways, so in 1789, during the later years of the period which is now commonly referred to as the Scientific Enlightenment, a man by the name of William Belsham wrote an essay which was titled On Liberty and Necessity. In this essay, which was regarding the subject of free will versus necessarianism, a long-dead philosophy which was basically a theologian argument for determinism, Belsham uses the term libertarian to describe the argument for free will in contrast with necessarianism. A little over a decade later, in 1802, a poem published in the British Critic by the author of Gebir first coined the term libertarian in its application to politics on page 432, referring to an individualist philosophy which rejects all general forms of political rule. The reason this is relevant and why I mention it, I'm sure many of you are asking, is because I've been taking a very long, hard look at how libertarians organize politically, how they message to non-libertarians, the libertarian political strategy, along with the framework from which most libertarian organizations approach political action from. This mainly is caused by libertarians, for reasons which will be expanded upon later, not applying or even really understanding what libertarian first principles are and the basis by which all thought on the subject was expanded upon throughout the 19th and early 20th century. So, libertarian first principles describe an individualist philosophy which rejects any description of morality conceptualizing laws around group interests at the expense of individual agency, which rejects all claims of possible legitimate political rule, and comes to these conclusions from the premise that all moral agents are necessarily entitled to the full product of their agency, and that there is no consistent argument another moral agent could present which would justify attempting to declare dominion over separate moral agents. While looking over the current state of political libertarianism, I've been forced to come to the unfortunate conclusion that pretty much everything about how libertarianism has been applied to politics over the last 70 years has been nothing but a chronic mess of organizations which are tone-deaf to their target audiences at best and what they seek to accomplish, attempt to utilize contradictory principles and operate within an applied framework that makes libertarian first principles entirely impossible to argue for or irrelevant, and also force libertarians to abridge potential advantages they have over other political allegiances in favor of inferior methods and tactics which they can never hope to work in their benefit. This being the result of both a mix of general mismanagement and deliberate sabotage on the part of the political elite, but we'll go more into that later. And every single one of these issues which political libertarianism has comes back almost universally to the meaning of what it actually is to be a libertarian being completely disregarded or forgotten about as a result of some of these various tactics. Now, to quickly add before I begin, this is by no means an attempt to somehow revise the foundational principles of libertarianism, or serve as an attempt to criticize the philosophical roots of libertarianism. On the contrary, every argument which is going to be made in this series stems directly from a consistent application of the first principles which form the foundation of libertarian philosophy. In fact, as I'm going to go more into detail with later, I'd argue that libertarianism isn't just the most viable and potentially influential political affiliation, but that the relative framework which libertarianism establishes creates a series of internal narratives which, applied to observation, are more dependable, decrease the potential for ambiguity to exist, and consequently creates a proclivity towards an application of the scientific method which can produce much more accurate results. So I'd argue that the utility of libertarian principles exceeds political debate, which is why it drives me absolutely insane to see people and groups that hold such a rich philosophy with such potential needlessly wasting it with such stupid mistakes. Anyway, the key to understanding exactly how one can best advertise and message their political beliefs to people who don't understand or don't agree is a topic which has long since been debated, but despite this is incredibly simple and well understood by mainstream political organizations, governments, or interest groups. And unsurprisingly, it is completely divorced from how most people are introduced to it through government education, civics, or the mainstream media. The government is a monopoly on arbitration, by which I mean it fundamentally at its core is an arbitration firm which uses coercion to suppress other arbiters who are independent and competitive from it in order for the state actors to be able to arbitrarily impose their will onto non-state actors on a systemic and consistent basis. This is why victimless actions can be considered a crime even though by definition there's no victim. So there's no realistic basis for someone engaging in this action to be considered a criminal, and people who have actually victimized others can never be held responsible for their actions if the state deems it to be in their interests for that not to be the case. This is an uncontroversial fact, and most people throw around the terms rule of law or law of the land casually and don't even realize the implications of the system or what it even is that they're defending. And I've previously gone into great detail over the practical and ethical problems of a state, particularly in the featured video on my channel, Why Governments Are Unsustainable, Justice Without a State, and my explanation of natural law, which is really outdated, but I digress. I only mention these videos because even though this video is explicitly directed at libertarians and anarchists or other people who have an understanding of libertarian arguments, along with libertarian first principles, there may be some people watching who are new or aren't familiar with these concepts, in which case a link to all of these videos will be located in the description. Anyway, this realization, aside from the aforementioned problems, creates two very interesting conclusions with some very serious political implications. Firstly, that all states, state firms, and organizations founded by states are laboring under a single set of hegemonic interests. These interests being to collect as much revenue as possible for the state, and to maintain a stable and friendly social order which allows the state to continue ruling with as little resistance from non-state actors as possible. Because the state as a parasitic firm fundamentally functions under a model which necessitates exponential growth, more specifically because governments are incapable of producing new resources. They're dependent on the production and speculation on the part of non-state actors. And as more industries along with resources and producers enter the market, the state requires more resources to be spent on collecting these resources and keeping these producers from trading around the state or creating new innovations which harm the state's interests. Any and all state services will therefore necessarily function with a different set of interests than the interest of non-state actors, since the function of a government is to operate in a manner which is necessarily at the direct expense of non-state actors, both in their premise and revealed preferences, as is the case for any organization which is incapable of production and requires parasitism to obtain revenue. And this can be demonstrated fairly easily by just about every monopolized service by the state, in contrast with what purpose these firms are intended to fill in the perspective of non-state actors to their interests. For instance, the interest of people who don't have any vested interests in ruling through the government or sustaining the government through its various organizations and firms, enrolling their children into education, are doing so with their perceived interest being that their children should develop skills which will help them navigate and find a comfortable, prosperous career path, and learn how to think critically, and develop the ability to formulate their own perception of the world so that they can better conceive of what their own interests are. Well, being that the government needs to have a decently expansive influence over how people associate in any society that it rules over in order to ensure that it can consistently collect revenue with as little expense as possible, and so that people have a more difficult time creating ways to undermine the state, and as previously noted, it's in the state's interest to have a population which doesn't perceive it to be a threat to very many of their own interests. So they teach children how to think and what to think within narrative structures designed to benefit the interests of the state, and it's on record stated by the designers of the model of the education system most modern governments utilize, known colloquially as the Prussian model, that this is the case. Now, the main political implication of this observation is that there exists a natural and necessary antagonism between the interests of state actors, any and all people or organizations operated or established by the government, and non-state actors, any and all people or organizations who are not in any way affiliated with the government. And this is a potentially very powerful advantage libertarianism has, which could be very easily applied to politics, incorporated both into our ethical and pragmatic messaging against political authority. In fact, this single point alone, if realized and utilized in libertarian messaging en masse, could make the principles of libertarianism resonate with mainstream audiences on a much broader scale. First of all, this power-oppression dichotomy applied to politics would certainly result in individual libertarians, along with political groups having a much easier time organizing and messaging in support of or denouncing certain political narratives and events around a single consistent message. This observation also makes libertarian principles in their application to political organization next to impossible to subvert, because by default libertarians would reject the possibility of ever allying with organizations and people of contradictory political allegiances along with the state. Secondly, and this is also the second inference which can be taken away from the government being a monopoly on arbitration, this realization necessarily forces one to deconstruct their own internal narrative for what they perceive political affiliations to be, because people are then presented with the fact that all mainstream media outlets, all politicians, and government agencies are all working towards a single set of goals which are antagonistic towards their own, despite presenting information and targeting different groups for their messaging, which suggest, if not outright attempt to make the case, that the group or person in question has separate goals from any other actor operating as an agent of the state.
There's another word for master narratives. It's called history. Basically, every country creates their own narrative story. And you know, my old job at the State Department was what people used to joke as the chief propagandist job. We haven't talked about propaganda. Propaganda, I'm not against propaganda. Every country does it, and they have to do it to their own population. And I don't necessarily think it's that awful. And this idea of a news cartel, I mean, I was editor of Time in 2012 during that election, and I remember, you know, you're competing against cartels and everybody. I remember being on a panel with the then editor of the New York Times who said, it's really hard to break through these days. This is the editor of the New York Times saying it's hard to break through. I wanted to jump off the platform. Like, what's it like for the rest of everybody? So, I mean, there are cartels, but cartels don't have hegemony like they used to.
I thought that it was a matter of real concern that planted stories intended to serve a national purpose abroad came home and were circulated here and believed here, because this would mean that the CIA could manipulate the news in the United States by channeling it through some foreign country. Now, we're looking at that very carefully.
Do you have any people being paid by the CIA who are contributing to a major circulation American journal?
We do have people who submit pieces to American journals.
Do you have any people paid by the CIA who are working for television networks?
This, I think, gets into the kind of getting into the details, Mr. Chairman, that I'd like to get into in executive session.
This is critical to the political application of libertarianism because association with the party system, or just the premise in general of utilizing state-run organizations to attempt to achieve political change from a pragmatic perspective, immediately gets taken off the table. At best, it becomes a waste of resources which could otherwise be utilized organizing in more effective ways, and at worst, it ensures that libertarians wouldn't be able to use key advantages in their messaging that they otherwise would have been able to had these libertarian groups not attempted to organize within the party system or with other state-connected political affiliations. Political affiliations as they exist within a state society are more or less an attempt by the political elite to specifically appeal to the material interests of people who happen to have varying marginal preferences, and pretty much nothing else. This is a direct result of a dysgenic effect on the social order which has been created by the existence of a state, and the concept of economic policy plans, coupled with the narrative promoted by the state, which is that only through the state can people have their material interests met, because otherwise, if their political allegiance loses an election, or isn't in power, the state will create laws which benefit the material interests of other allegiances who have differing preferences than their own. The state has in turn created a zero-sum dichotomy between people who have different marginal preferences from one another. In fact, if you were to look back at all of the earliest forms of republics and parliamentary democratic governments established after the collapse of feudalism, which utilized concepts within liberal philosophy espoused during the Enlightenment period as a justification for their rule, and the earliest characteristics regarding political affiliation defined by the political elite of this time period, particularly the left-right dichotomy in the case of the French National Assembly where the terms first originated, and the state's current narrative for what characterizes a political affiliation, the left being supportive of egalitarianism, progress, and opposed to social hierarchy, with the right being supportive of social hierarchies and traditionalism. Colonial history in the US was relatively similar, with a near identical description of what the two parties quote-unquote represented. But this dichotomy, or any other built upon the same foundational premise as this one, are clearly incapable of consistently describing distinctions between philosophies and principles to any meaningful extent. These descriptions are clearly designed to appeal to and grab the attention of the material interest of the state's populations. And according to the people who subscribe to the left-right dichotomy, there are identical or near-identical philosophies being applied to politics which would fall under both sides of this dichotomy and narrative structure for what they seek to achieve. Great examples of which would be the distinction between fascism and Marxism. Colloquially, fascism is associated with the furthest right end of the left-right dichotomy, while Marxism is associated with the furthest left end, despite both political allegiances arguing that an authoritative central government should ideally exist which establishes complete expansion over the production of and management of all resources, along with how those resources are distributed. both of these allegiances utilize social justice and identitarian concepts in their messaging. Both have a pretty strong personality cult as a result of the second point, and both allegiances are heavily militaristic, and in many cases, followers and or major figures openly advocate for the use of violence against people of arbitrarily defined enemy allegiances. In fact, the only meaningful distinction between these allegiances largely boils down to the groups which they demagogue to, or the specific targets of their social justice, and how both allegiances conceptualize the state within their own relative frameworks. Anyway, by attempting to organize within the party system or under any other tactic which necessitates utilizing the state or operating within the state's interests, libertarians lose what is hands down the biggest advantage which they otherwise have over all other political allegiances, which is that in a stateless society, because there is no state and therefore no monopoly on arbitration, there exists no zero-sum dichotomy between material interests, and people of all different marginal preferences can associate with others of similar traits within mutually beneficial exchanges with relative ease, and as a result, libertarians are capable of appealing to the material interests of every single group of people simultaneously while remaining 100% consistent in principle. But by associating within the party system and allying with conflicting political allegiances, libertarians lose the ability to appeal to people of all interests because they put themselves into a position where they're forced to propose a state-imposed central policy plan and just generally have to make the case for why their allegiance has to conflict with others which it in reality doesn't have to, in order to appeal to the groups of people espousing contradictory principles which the libertarians decided to ally with for some reason, which people of many political allegiances understandably will see as a threat to their own material interests and therefore will reject libertarianism. A study conducted in 2008 entitled Partisanship, Voting, and the Dopamine D2 Receptor Gene by Professors Christopher T. Dawes and James H. Fowler from the University of California of people who identified as Democrats and Republicans. These two groups were shown two clips. One of George W. Bush praising Enron and issuing a statement of public support on the part of the U.S. government for Enron. The other was a clip post-Enron scandal of Bush publicly trying to distance himself from Enron. Their identified political allegiance determined their instinctive reaction to each video, which was that the video going against their political allegiance was met with the same sensation the brain creates as discomfort or pain. The video which affirmed their political allegiance was met with a hit of dopamine. This is because political allegiances to most people have little, if anything, to do with philosophy, since as I've demonstrated, they are functionally incapable of doing so within the framework created by the state. Instead, people associate political allegiances with material interests, which is why it's important that libertarianism establishes itself as an anti-political allegiance. Now, it seems that the well-intentioned party-arc libertarians who aren't just government shills trying to destroy libertarianism from within have somewhat realized this and have tried to fix this problem throughout the last 30 years or so by advertising libertarianism as if it's a tool which other people of other political allegiances could utilize that complements their own interests. But this ultimately has only exacerbated the problem which was already created by libertarians attempting to utilize state violence and buying into the narrative of representative government, which is that it causes libertarianism to lose all of the other pragmatic advantages which it gained through its first principles. But this has made the problem far worse because this approach, on top of making libertarianism less effective, has ended up causing the original principles of libertarianism to be obscured entirely through the process of co-optation. Because now there are non-libertarians identifying their beliefs with libertarianism as an explanation for what libertarianism is, And because the Libertarian Party particularly has attempted to appeal to every political allegiance, virtually every political allegiance is doing this. People from Bill Maher, Kyle Kalinske, all the way to Glenn Beck or Neil Bortz. The latter of which argued on air that the state should use force to suppress dissenters against the Iraq War. But these people all can now identify with libertarianism, and the political elite very much loves this, because now the original principles of what libertarianism stood for, most commonly referred to as individualist anarchism, have become very obscure. Starting to see a resurgence in recent years, but nonetheless not anything near what could be considered the idea that floats around in the conscience of most people when they think of libertarianism. And libertarianism has been completely divorced from this concept in mainstream politics. It's for this reason, actually, that this is a pretty regular tactic employed by the state whenever a political movement or ideology which threatens their interests begins to gain prominence. The Tea Party movement, for instance, was originally a movement dedicated to exposing the 9/11 Commission report's hokey methodology and omission of crucial pieces of information, presented by the media and politicians as a group of anti-government extremists protesting corruption. Within the Republican Party, with little to no mention of the group's actual stated goals or principles. Then, pretty soon, a bunch of boomer Republicans started identifying with the Tea Party movement as an organization dedicated to protesting perceived corruption within the Republican Party, and consequently, the original goals of the movement were slowly forgotten. Sure, it's very easy, actually, starting from libertarian principles to create pragmatic arguments against the state, and I don't even think I need to comment on how well locked down libertarians have the ethical arguments. It's to the point where statists will actively try to change the subject and divert attention when a debate approaches ethical realities between the two groups, or will attempt to respond with a pragmatic argument disguised as an ethical argument, along with the occasional attempts to hand-wave the discussion of principles away by feebly attempting to appeal to relativism. We'll be going over this point in more detail in part 2 of the series, but as for now, most libertarians fail to realize that information, ethical truisms, and the data itself is not enough to message effectively to people who have conceptualized the world within a radically different framework around a different series of narratives. And this can be no better demonstrated than when confronting statists with examples of politicians or other state actors such as police officers simply doing what anyone in that position would do, where someone is directly incentivized to aggress upon others in order to make their ends meet and have absolutely no way of being held accountable for their transgressions, and simply respond with retorts such as, well, that's why you need to vote! We are the government! They represent us! Or, and this one's my personal favorite, we just need better laws! Now, to anyone who's actually analyzing how government functions from a practical standpoint or understands human incentives, these aren't even attempted rebuttals. These are just empty bromides which one's mind frantically spits out in the face of a challenge to the perceived worldview and the arguments which support that worldview. But the problem is that statists are actually thinking about how government functions from a practical level, human incentives, what political authority is, and what the incentives of their rulers are. But the reason that they're making such stupid arguments like this is because the libertarian and the statist are operating around a fundamentally different series of structural narratives and process the information which they're interpreting through an entirely different narrative structure. To us libertarians, the problems caused by the state and political rule are a slam dunk, and recognizing them is fairly straightforward. But statists are operating around the narrative that the state actors represent their interests somehow, that their interests couldn't be met if the state wasn't involved somehow in every transaction, and the Hobbesian state of nature, where without a political ruler, people would just kill and plunder as they please. And it's for this reason that these narrative structures are propagated constantly by government education, the state-run media, and state actors. Now, even though the in-depth libertarian rebuttals to all of these narratives specifically are numerous, and most libertarians have no particular issue debunking them accordingly, the problem here ultimately boils down to the lack of any substantial and consistent counter-narrative to that which is propagated by the state in most political messaging from libertarians. Which is why, aside from all of the specifically addressed benefits utilizing the information presented by this video provides libertarians in their political application, the recognition of this inherent class dichotomy which libertarian principles naturally create actually provides a fix which is absolutely imperative for libertarian principles in order to gain notable prominence in society. This class dichotomy attached to libertarian principles establishes a default counter-narrative to that which is propagated by the state. Not only this, but it incidentally happens to be the most powerful form of counter-narrative which could be conveyed, which is one that simultaneously deconstructs the established narratives and constructs a new narrative which appeals to the specific interests of all statists, something which, to my understanding, libertarianism has no other means of even coming close to being able to do. It also provides a way in which libertarians will be able to weed out fake libertarians trying to subvert our political movements, and by default ensure that libertarians won't consider allying with non-libertarians to be in their interests. Now, before I end this part, I'll address in advance one major objection to what I've proposed here, which I thought of while I was writing this and received when I was proposing some of these ideas, which is that this isn't quite a positive realization, rather this dooms libertarianism to a quote-unquote purity spiral, which will cause any political group or movement which utilizes this in their messaging to lose momentum from infighting the moment that it actually gains significant traction. Now, this argument is pretty much purely a consequence of exactly all of the mistakes which I mentioned in this video that libertarians have been making, and delves more into why libertarianism can't and shouldn't ally with other political affiliations. Any philosophical stance which has a defined set of principles and attempts to make a substantive truth claim regarding any subject necessarily will have to reject people in groups who promote principles and make arguments which run contrary to that stance, which the said philosophy takes. Because as mentioned earlier, if this doesn't happen, then the initial principles the group or person espoused necessarily has to be tossed aside in the process to accommodate the new people with opposing principles, and in turn, this group will lose their ability to effectively message. Though people who would argue this, such as Jordan Peterson or Styx Hexenhammer, do have a valid point if this were to be applied to an identitarian philosophy, such as ethno-nationalism or Marxism. Identitarian philosophies all propose a series of truth claims respective to their own principles, and they too share some of the advantages which libertarianism has in their messaging, particularly in that because they utilize a power-oppression dichotomy universally, groups which espouse these ideas can organize relatively easily, and can establish a somewhat cohesive counter-narrative to the one propagated by the state under the current political order. order, though these groups still are weaker than libertarianism. For instance, they don't have the ability to appeal to the interests of every political affiliation, or the fact that they have no means of organizing in a manner which produces material gains, and are dependent entirely on psychic profit, which means that they would have to convince people to agree with them before the said people could receive any benefit in participating in any forms of direct action, whereas libertarians have counter-economics. However, their biggest problem, and ultimately why no grassroots political organizations based around identitarian principles can ever become massively influential and always end up eating themselves from the insides, is because identitarian conceptions of power and oppression attempt to dichotomize the interests which they attempt to explain based on identity, or in the case of Marxism, will try to argue that non-identity-based characteristics are identity-based characteristics in order to then dichotomize these made-up arbitrary identities. Well, the issue is that it's impossible to establish objectively what the characteristics of an identitarian interest are, because while there are many people who have these traits as aspects of their identity, i.e. race, gender, sexual orientation, there is no such thing as a racial interest, because people are individuals with their own individual preferences shaped by a practically infinite number of variables, meaning that ultimately everyone's interests are going to be different to at least some extent. This purity spiraling effect within these organizations is not a negative trait. On the contrary, philosophical movements naturally will attempt to do this in order to remain consistent to their original principles, and because of this, identitarian groups will destroy themselves, since the principles which these philosophies are based around are centered around arguments which don't have any tangible definitions, or even the ability to ever provide them. Ethno-nationalists destroy themselves fighting over what a true white person is, or what a white interest is. Marxists destroy themselves fighting over what a working class interest is, or what the working class even is. Libertarianism, on the other hand, doesn't attempt to establish any sort of power-oppression dichotomy based around an arbitrary group of identity-based interests. In fact, such a concept would contradict the fundamental principles of libertarianism as an individualist philosophy. The libertarian class dichotomy argues from a purely materialistic and legal basis. Therefore, any so-called purity spiral under this framework would actually make libertarian movement stronger, which is what I mean when I mentioned earlier that it makes subversion much more difficult. Anyway, so that's the end of part 1. Thank you all for watching. Any and all feedback would be greatly appreciated. And part 2, as mentioned earlier, is going to be going over debate tactics.